Hello, my friend. Today I bring you another lost legend from the depths of Middle-earth. Close your eyes, feel the magic surround you. Our journey begins. In the days when Gil-galad yet bore the crown of the Noldor in Lindon, and before the shadow of Sauron had fallen upon the fair realm of Eregion, there came tidings from the south that filled the hearts of the wise with dread. For in those years, the hidden kingdom of Nargothrond stood mighty beneath the earth, carved deep in the caverns beside the river Narog, where Finrod Felagund had raised halls of wonder that rivaled even the majesty of Menegroth. Yet in the high towers of the realm, where the banners of the house of Finarfin caught the last light of Erendil's star, there walked one whose heart had grown cold with pride and whose counsel had turned toward paths that the Eldar should not tread. Celegorm the Fair, son of Feanor, dwelt there still in those days, and with him his brother Curufin the Crafty, and their words fell like shadow upon the bright halls of Orodreth the king. The wind that came from the north in those days bore upon it more than the scent of pine and mountain snow. It carried whispers of the grinding ice and of oaths sworn beneath starlight that would not be broken, not though the world should burn. In the deep places of the earth, where the forges of Nargothrond glowed red with the heat of creation, smiths wrought works of beauty and terror, and the clash of hammer upon anvil echoed like the beating of a great heart in the darkness. But there were other sounds in the deeps of Nargothrond in those days, sounds that came not from any forge of the Eldar. In the uttermost depths, where even the keen eyes of the Noldor could not pierce the gloom, something moved that had not been wakened since the music of creation was first sung. The servants of Morgoth, it was whispered, had found secret ways into the realm, and their feet left tracks of ice upon the stone floors that had known only the light tread of the firstborn. King Orodreth, who had taken the crown reluctantly when Finrod his brother rode to his doom with Beren son of Barahir, felt the weight of kingship heavy upon his brow. In the council chambers, where once the wisdom of Felagund had guided all decisions, now voices rose in anger and dissent. Some spoke of war and glory, of riding forth to meet the enemy in open battle. Others counseled patience and the keeping of the hidden ways, trusting in the strength of stone and the secrecy that had long protected their realm. Yet none among them, save perhaps the wisest, understood that the shadow which crept toward Nargothrond came not from without, but from within, from the very hearts of those who dwelt in the deeps. For pride, which had been the downfall of the Noldor in Valinor, had taken root again in the halls beneath the earth, and like a poisonous plant, it grew in darkness, fed by the whispered promises of power and the bitter memory of ancient wrongs. The river Narog, which flowed past the hidden doors of the kingdom, began to run strangely in those days. Its waters, which had always been clear as crystal and sweet to drink, grew dark and troubled. Fish no longer swam in its depths, and the willows that grew along its banks let fall their leaves, though it was yet far from the season of their sleeping. The folk of Nargothrond marked these signs with growing unease, but their king, burdened with the cares of rule and the weight of his crown, heard their concerns as if from a great distance. In the armories of the realm, where weapons of Eldarin craft hung upon the walls like sleeping stars, something stirred. The great sword Anglachel, which Thingol had given to Beleg the Strongbow, had found its way into the treasure halls of Nargothrond through paths of blood and sorrow. And in the darkness of that place, the black blade sang with a voice like winter wind, and its song was of doom and the ending of all bright things beneath the sun and moon. Beyond the hidden gates of Nargothrond, where the great bridge spanned the waters of Narog, the forest of Brethil grew dark and watchful. In those days, the trees still remembered the voices of the Ents, though their shepherds had long since withdrawn to the deeper woods. Yet now even these ancient guardians spoke in hushed tones of a creeping malice that moved beneath their boughs. Túrin, son of Húrin, walked among these trees in the grey hours before dawn, his black sword, Gurthang, heavy at his side. The blade that had once been Anglekel sang no longer, for it had been reforged in the fires of grief and bore now a new name and a darker purpose. In the growing light, the young lord of Dor Lomin moved like a shadow himself, his mind troubled by dreams that came not from Urmo the Gentle, but from darker realms where hope grew thin. The morning mist rose from the river like the breath of sleeping giants, and in its coils shapes moved that were not wholly of the waking world. Túrin paused upon a stone that jutted from the hillside and gazed toward the hidden realm that had given him sanctuary. But in his heart, a doubt grew like poison ivy upon a fair tree, for he had begun to question the wisdom of remaining in the halls of stone while his people suffered under the heel of Morgoth. From the depths of Brethil came a sound like singing, but no voice of elf or mortal made that melody. It rose and fell like the wind through broken towers, and in its cadence was the memory of cities burned and kingdoms fallen. The trees swayed, though no breeze stirred their branches, and their leaves whispered warnings in the old tongue that few now living could understand. In Nargothrond, King Orodreth started from his seat as if struck by a cold wind. The crown upon his brow seemed suddenly heavy as lead, and the light of the lamps flickered as though some great shadow had passed between them and their flames. His guards looked to him with questioning eyes, but the king's gaze was turned inward, seeking some sign or portent that might explain the sudden chill that had settled upon his heart. The voice that spoke then came not from any throat of flesh, but from the very stones of the realm itself. It was the voice of Finrod Felagund, who had died in the dungeons of Tolkien, yet whose spirit had not passed beyond the circles of the world. "Brother mine," it whispered, "beware the pride that was our father's bane. For even now the shadow reaches toward thy halls, and the light that I kindled grows dim." Orodreth rose from his throne, his hand upon his sword, but there was naught to see save the familiar halls and the faces of his people. Yet the warning echoed in the vaulted chambers, and even the boldest among the Noldor felt their hearts grow cold. For they knew that their king had heard the voice of the dead, and such visitations came only when great doom was near at hand. In the grey lands between Nargothrond and the realm of Doriath, where the grass grew thin and the stones lay bare beneath the weeping sky, a lone rider came down from the northern passes. His horse was black as midnight, and his cloak streamed behind him like the wings of some great bird of prey. This was Beleg Strongbow, chief of the March Wardens of Thingol, and his errand was urgent and dark. The Elf Lord had ridden without rest for 7 days and 7 nights, following paths that led through the haunted valleys where the spirits of the slain wandered still. His keen eyes, which could pierce the veils of mist and shadow, had seen things upon the road that filled his heart with dread. For armies were moving in the north, and the banners that flew above them bore no device of any free people of Middle-earth. Behind him, the girdle of Melian still held, keeping the realm of Doriath safe from the malice of the enemy. But Beleg had passed beyond that blessed boundary on the orders of his king, for word had come to the halls of Menegroth that spoke of a growing shadow in the land. Túrin Turambar, son of sorrow, had vanished from the woodlands of Brethil, and with him had gone the black sword that could cleave both flesh and spirit. The wind that came from the east carried upon it the scent of burning, and smoke rose from places where no fires should have been kindled. Beleg's horse snorted and shied, for even the noble beasts of the Eldar could sense the wrongness that crept across the land like a creeping plague. The very air seemed thick and poisonous, as though some great furnace burned beneath the earth and sent up its fumes to choke the sky. As he drew near to the borders of Nargothrond, the elf lord saw that the trees along the riverbank stood leafless and stark, though it was yet the height of summer. Their branches reached toward the sky like the arms of supplicants, but no answer came to their silent prayers. The grass beneath their roots had withered, and where once flowers had bloomed, now only thorns and bitter weeds grew in the poisoned soil. Beleg's heart was heavy as he beheld these signs, for he remembered the days when this land had been fair and green, when the songs of his people had echoed through the woods, and the rivers had run clear and sweet. Now all was changed, and the shadow of Morgoth lay upon the earth like a curse that could not be lifted. The very stones seemed to weep for the beauty that was lost, and the wind carried their lament to the uttermost corners of the world. At the hidden ford where the secret path led to the gates of Nargothrond, the elf lord paused and dismounted. His horse trembled beneath him, and its eyes rolled white with fear, for even the beasts could sense the wrongness that emanated from the hidden realm. Beleg laid his hand upon the creature's neck and spoke to it in the ancient tongue, but his words brought little comfort. The shadow had grown too strong, and its tendrils reached even into the hearts of the innocent. Before the great bridge that spanned the rushing waters of Narog, Beleg stood in the fading light of day and gazed upon the hidden gates of Nargothrond. Carved they were from the living rock of the hillside, and wrought with such skill that even the keen eyes of the Eldar could scarce discern where stone ended and artifice began. Yet now those fair portals seemed to leer at him like the mouths of some great beast, and shadows pooled in their carved recesses like stagnant water. The guards who watched from the towers above were clad in mail that gleamed like silver in the twilight, but their faces were grim and their eyes held no welcome for the messenger from Doriath. Long had the realms of Thingol and Orodreth been allies in the war against the Dark Lord, yet pride and ancient grievances had grown between them like thorns in a garden once fair. Now even the bonds of kinship seemed fragile as spider's silk in the face of the growing shadow. "Hold, son of Doriath," called a voice from the walls. "What brings thee to our gates in this dark hour? Speak thy name and thy errand, or pass hence and trouble us no more." Beleg raised his head and called back in a voice that rang clear as a silver bell, "I am Beleg Cuthalion, chief of the Marchwardens of King Thingol, and I bear tidings that may not wait. Let me pass, for my errand is urgent, and the need is great. But the guards upon the walls conferred among themselves in voices too low to carry, and their debate went on while the stars began to kindle in the darkening sky. At length, one among them called down, "The ways are closed, Lord of Doriath. Our king receives no guests in these troubled times, and our halls are barred to all who come from the outer lands." The elf lord's heart sank at these words, for he knew that fear had taken root in the hidden realm, and with fear came the closing of hearts and the shutting of doors that should remain open to the free peoples of Middle-earth. Yet still he persisted, for his message was too important to be turned aside by the pride of guards or the fears of kings. "Then say unto your king," Beleg called, "that the son of Húrin has taken the black blade and gone forth into darkness. Say that armies gather in the north where no armies should be, and that the shadow reaches even unto the eaves of Doriath. These tidings I bear from Thingol the Grey, and they may not be denied." A long silence fell then upon the walls, broken only by the sound of the river rushing over its stones and the whisper of wind through the reeds. At last, the great gates groaned upon their hinges, and slowly they swung inward, revealing the lamplit passage that led to the halls beneath the hill. But the guards who came forth to meet him bore spears, and their faces were hard as stone. Down the winding passages of Nargothrond went Beleg the strongbow, his footsteps echoing in the vaulted halls where once the voices of the Noldor had lifted in songs of joy and triumph. Now those same corridors rang hollow and empty, and shadows gathered in every corner like living things that watched and waited. The lamps that had been wrought to burn with the light of Valinor flickered and dimmed, as though some fell breath sought to extinguish their flame. The guards who led him walked in silence, their armor clanking with each step, and their eyes darted nervously to the darkened alcoves where statues of the great kings stood like sentinels of the past. These carved figures, wrought with all the skill of Eldarin craftsmen, seemed to Beleg's keen sight to have changed since last he walked these halls. Their faces, once noble and serene, now bore expressions of sorrow and foreboding, as though the very stone had absorbed the grief and fear that filled the hidden realm. As they descended deeper into the heart of the stronghold, the air grew thick and oppressive, heavy with the scent of metal and stone and something else, a corruption that seemed to seep from the very walls themselves. The elf lord's hand moved instinctively to the hilt of his sword, for his warrior's instincts warned him of danger, though no foe could be seen in the lamplit passages. At length they came to the great hall where King Orodreth held court, a vast chamber carved from the living rock and adorned with pillars that rose like the trunks of mighty trees. Here had Finrod Felagund once sat in majesty, dispensing wisdom and justice to his people. But now the throne seemed too large for the one who occupied it, and the crown upon Orodreth's brow appeared to weigh him down like a burden he could barely bear. The king looked up as Beleg entered, and the elf lord saw in those grey eyes a weariness that went deeper than the fatigue of the body. It was the weariness of the spirit, the exhaustion that comes to those who have borne too heavy a load for too long a time. Around the throne stood the councillors and captains of Nargothrond, but their faces were grim, and their whispers spoke of doubt and division, rather than unity and strength. "Welcome, Beleg of Doriath," said Orodreth, and his voice echoed strangely in the vast hall, as though it came from a great distance. Long has it been since we have received tidings from the halls of Thingol. What news bring you from the girdle of Melian? But before Beleg could answer, a cold wind stirred through the hall, though no window or door stood open to the outer air. The flames of the torches guttered and nearly died, and for a moment all was plunged into a darkness so complete that even the keen eyes of the Eldar could not pierce it. In that blackness, something moved, not with the sound of footsteps, but with a rustling like the wings of bats or the whisper of dry leaves in an autumn wind. When the light returned, all in the hall stood as they had before, yet each felt that something had changed, as though an unwelcome presence had brushed against their minds and left behind a touch of ice. Beleg's hand was upon his sword hilt, and his eyes swept the shadows. But whatever had passed through the hall had left no trace of its passing, save the chill that lingered in the air. "The shadow grows strong," whispered one of the counselors, an aged elf whose wisdom had been prized in the days of Finrod. "Even here, in the deep places beneath the earth, we are not safe from its reach." King Orodreth raised his hand for silence, but his face was pale as moonlight, and Beleg saw that fear had taken root even in the heart of the king. The message he bore seemed suddenly more urgent than ever, for it was clear that Nargothrond was already under siege, not by armies of orcs or dragons, but by something far more insidious, the corruption of despair itself. In the deepest dungeons of Nargothrond, where even the light of the Silmarils could not have pierced the gloom, there lay a prisoner whose presence few among the Noldor knew. Chained, he was with bonds of iron wrought in the forges of Angband, and his raiment, once fair and bright, was now stained with the filth of long captivity. Yet his eyes still burned with the light of the Eldar, though dimmed by suffering and long despair. This was Gelmir of Angrod's people, taken in the great defeat at the Dagor Bragolach, when the flame of Morgoth had swept across Beleriand like a tide of destruction. For 7 years he had languished in the pits of Angband, and for 7 more he had been held in the hidden chambers of Nargothrond, brought there by ways that none would speak of openly. His captors called him mad, for he spoke ever of visions and prophecies that none could understand. The guards who watched him were few, for what threat could one broken elf pose to the mighty realm of Nargothrond? Yet they kept their distance nonetheless, for there was something in his gaze that made even the bravest among them uneasy. When he spoke, which was seldom, his words were like riddles wrapped in shadow, and those who heard him felt their hearts grow heavy with foreboding. On this night, as Beleg delivered his dark tidings to the king above, Gelmir raised his head and spoke to the darkness that surrounded him. His voice was cracked and harsh from long silence, yet still it carried the authority of one who had looked upon things that mortal eyes should never see. "The hour approaches," he whispered to the stone walls that had become his world. "The black breath rises, and the golden halls shall know the taste of ash. I have seen the eagles weeping, and the rivers running red with more than blood. The son of Hurin shall be the key that unlocks the door, and through that door shall come the ending of all bright things." In the upper halls, King Orodreth felt a sudden chill, as though a cold hand had touched his heart. He turned to Beleg with eyes wide with a fear he could not name, and his voice trembled as he spoke. "What is this darkness you speak of?" What armies gather in the north? Tell me true, for I sense that doom walks among us even now." Beleg looked about the great hall, noting how the shadows seemed to press closer with each passing moment, and how the faces of the councillors grew ever more grim and watchful. He thought of the prisoner in the depths below, though he knew not of his existence, and felt the weight of prophecy settling upon them all like a shroud. "My lord," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the vaulted chamber, "Túrin Turambar has taken the black blade Gurthung and gone forth from Brethil. In his wake, the very trees wither and die, and strange lights are seen in the northern sky. The servants of Morgoth move in great numbers, but they march not under banners of war. They come as shadows in the night, seeking something or someone." In the dungeons far below, Gelmir laughed, a sound like the breaking of glass in an empty tomb. For he alone among all those in Nargothrond knew what the enemy sought, and why the hidden realm could no longer remain hidden. The curse of the Noldor was coming home at last, and neither stone nor steel could turn aside the doom that approached on silent feet. "Let them come," he whispered to the darkness. "Let them all come, for the fire is already kindled, and the halls of stone shall burn as bright as any pyre beneath the stars." As the night deepened over Nargothrond, and the councillors debated long into the dark hours, a voice came upon the wind that chilled the blood of all who heard it. It spoke not in the black speech of Mordor, for that tongue had not yet been devised, but in words of power that predated the coming of the Eldar to Middle-earth. The very stones of the hidden realm trembled at its utterance, and the lamps flickered as though some great shadow had passed between them and their flames. In the great hall, King Orodreth started from his throne as the voice rolled through the vaulted chambers like distant thunder. The councillors looked to one another with eyes wide with terror, for they recognized in that fell speech the power of Morgoth himself, though the Dark Lord sat still upon his throne in Angband, far to the north. This was another voice, one that served the master, but was not the master, a lieutenant of darkness, whose name was whispered only in the most secret councils of the wise. "Children of Finwë," the voice spoke, and its words seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "Long have you hidden in your holes of stone, thinking yourselves safe from the wrath of your betters. But the hour of reckoning draws near, and no depth of earth shall shield you from the doom that you have earned. The oath breakers shall find no peace, neither in life nor in death, and their kingdoms shall burn as Gondolin burned, as Doriath shall burn, as all the bright realms of the Eldar shall burn in the fires of my master's wrath." Beleg drew his sword, though there was no foe to be seen, and the blade gleamed white in the lamplight, as though it had caught some reflection of the light of Arundel's star. The guards in the hall raised their spears, but they trembled in their hands, for what weapons of mortal craft could avail against the voice of shadow itself? The voice laughed then, and its mirth was like the sound of breaking glass and falling stones. "Do you think your little blades can harm me, children of the lesser light? I who walked with Melkor before the lamps were lit, I who saw the music broken and remade according to my master's will. Your swords are toys, your walls are paper, and your courage is as grass before the fire." King Orodreth rose from his throne, and though his face was pale with fear, his voice rang clear and strong as he spoke. "Name yourself, servant of darkness, that we may know our enemy? By what right do you trouble the peace of Nargothrond? By what authority do you threaten the children of Ilúvatar in their own halls? Authority, the voice replied, and now its tone was soft and mocking, like the whisper of wind through a graveyard. I am the shadow behind every shadow, the fear that walks in your dreams. I am the voice that spoke to Feanor in the darkness of Formenos, the hand that kindled the ships at Losgar, the thought that turns brother against brother and friend against friend. I need no authority save that which darkness holds over light and chaos over order. In the dungeons below, Gelmir the prisoner began to weep, for he recognized that voice from his years of torment in Angband. It was the voice of one of the Umayyad, the fallen servants of the Valar who had followed Melkor into exile and corruption. This one had been present at his torturing, had whispered poisonous words in his ear during the long nights of agony and despair. Sauron, Gelmir whispered to his chains. Sauron the deceiver, Gorthor the cruel. He comes not with armies, but with lies, not with swords, but with the corruption of hearts. Guard well your thoughts, O King of Nargothrond, for he seeks not to conquer your realm, but to make you the instrument of its own destruction. Above, the voice of the enemy's servant faded like smoke upon the wind, but its words lingered in the minds of all who had heard them. The seeds of doubt and fear had been planted, and even now they began to take root in soil made fertile by pride and ancient grievances. The fall of Nargothrond had begun not with the charge of armies or the breath of dragons, but with whispered words in the darkness of a single night. When the voice of shadow had faded from the halls of Nargothrond, a silence fell that was deeper than the quiet of tombs. In that stillness, hearts beat like war drums, and breath came short and sharp to those who had heard the words of the enemy's servant. Yet it was Beleg of Doriath who first found his voice, and when he spoke, his words rang with the authority of one who had walked in the light of the two trees and remembered still their radiance. Evil has spoken here this night, he said, his voice cutting through the oppressive quiet like a blade through silk. But evil speaks only lies, and its words have no power save that which we give them through our fear. I have looked upon the girdle of Melian, and I know that light is stronger than darkness, that hope endures though the stars should fail. King Orodreth looked upon the messenger from Doriath with eyes that held a glimmer of the courage that had been his brother's, and slowly he descended from his throne. The crown upon his brow seemed lighter now, as though the words of Beleg had lifted some portion of the burden that weighed upon his spirit. You speak truly, Lord of Doriath, the king said. Yet still I ask, what would you have us do? Our realm is hidden, our people safe behind walls of stone. Should we abandon the wisdom of ages and ride forth to battle an enemy we cannot see? But before Beleg could answer, a new light began to grow in the great hall. Not the steady glow of lamp or torch, but a flickering radiance that seemed to dance and leap like living flame. The councillors gasped and stepped back, for the light came not from any earthly source, but from the very air itself, and in its brightness they glimpsed shapes and forms that filled their hearts with wonder. It was the fire of Arendil's ship, sailing still among the stars far above the circles of the world, and its light had found a way to pierce even the depths of Nargothrond. In that radiance stood a figure tall and fair, robed in white and silver, with eyes that held the memory of the uttermost west. This was no vision or sending of the mind, but a true presence, one of the Istari who had come across the sea in the days of Nargothrond's founding. "Fear not the words of the deceiver," spoke the figure, and his voice was like the sound of silver bells in a high tower. "For though darkness may whisper, the music of creation sings still, and no power of shadow can unmake what Ilúvatar has wrought. Yet neither may you hide forever in halls of stone, thinking to escape the doom that walks the world. The time of choosing is upon you, and each must decide whether to kindle his own light or be consumed by the darkness of others." The wizard, for such he was, though his name was not yet spoken in the halls of men, raised his staff, and from its crystal head poured forth a light so pure and bright that even the shadows in the farthest corners of the hall were driven away. In that radiance, the councillors of Nargothrond saw themselves as they truly were, not the mighty lords they imagined, but frightened elves who had forgotten the courage of their ancestors. "The enemy seeks to divide you through fear," the wizard continued. "He whispers lies in the darkness, telling you that your doom is certain, your cause hopeless. But I say to you that hope is never lost while courage remains, and courage is kindled not by the absence of fear, but by the choice to act in spite of it." King Orodreth stepped forward into the light, and as its radiance touched him, something of his brother's nobility returned to his bearing. "Then tell us, wise one, what path we should take, for I confess that my heart is heavy with doubt, and the counsels of my lords are divided." The wizard smiled, and in that expression was all the wisdom of ages and the compassion of one who had looked upon suffering and found it not without purpose. "The path lies not in my words, but in your own heart, son of Finarfin. Yet this I will say, darkness flees before the light, and the light shines brightest when kindled by willing hands." When the dawn came pale and grey over the hills of Nargothrond, Beleg took his leave of the hidden realm, bearing with him words that would echo in the councils of the wise for years to come. King Orodreth had chosen at last to break the silence that had shrouded his people, and messages were even now being prepared for the lords of all the free realms of Beleriand. The time of hiding was ending, and with it the long years of division among the Eldar. Yet as the Elf Lord rode north through the withered lands, his heart was heavy with foreboding. For though the light of the wizard had driven away the immediate darkness, the words of the enemy's servant still rang in his mind like the tolling of funeral bells. Sauron, the deceiver, had not come to Nargothrond merely to spread fear. He had come to plant seeds of corruption that would grow in the darkness of men's hearts long after his voice had faded. The path that led toward Doriath wound through valleys where no birds sang and across streams that ran black beneath the clouded sky. Even the hardy mountain ponies that had once grazed in these uplands were gone, fled to safer pastures, or fallen prey to the wolves that now roamed the empty lands. The very stones seemed to weep for the beauty that was lost, and the wind carried upon it the scent of distant fires. At the ford of Brithiach, where the river Brithon met the Syrian in days of old, Beleg paused to water his horse and rest beneath the shadow of the ancient bridge. Here, in years past, the merchants and messengers of many realms had met to trade news and goods, and the sound of laughter had echoed across the waters. Now only the wind spoke, and its words were of sorrow and loss. As he sat beside the dark water, the elf lord became aware that he was not alone. A figure approached from the eastern bank, tall and cloaked in grey, with a staff in his hand and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. This was no common traveller, for his step was light upon the ground, and his presence seemed to bring with it a sense of peace that had been absent from the land for many days. "Well met, Beleg Strongbow," said the stranger, and his voice was familiar, though his face remained hidden in shadow. "I perceive that you bear tidings from the halls beneath the hill. Are they good tidings or ill?" Beleg looked up in wonder, for he recognized the voice of the wizard who had appeared in Nargothrond, though how he had come to this place so swiftly was beyond the elf's understanding. "Both good and ill, my lord," he replied. "The king has chosen to break his silence and send word to all the free peoples. Yet I fear that his choice comes too late, for the shadow has already taken root in his realm." The wizard nodded gravely and settled beside him on the riverbank. "Indeed, the corruption spreads like poison in a wound, and each day that passes sees it grow stronger. Yet do not despair, for even the darkest night must yield to dawn, and hope endures, though the stars should fail." "You speak as one who has seen the end of this tale," Beleg said. "Tell me, wise one, what doom awaits the hidden kingdom? Will the light of Nargothrond be extinguished, or will it shine forth one last time before the darkness claims it?" The wizard was silent for a long moment, his gaze turned toward the south, where the towers of Nargothrond lay hidden beneath the earth. When at last he spoke, his words were heavy with the weight of prophecy and the sorrow of one who has seen too much of the world's pain. "The light will shine," he said softly. "It will shine so brightly that even the servants of darkness will shield their eyes from its radiance. But like the flame of a candle in a great wind, it will burn fiercely and then be gone, leaving only memory and the hope of renewal in some distant day." In the cold halls of Erebor, where the lonely mountain stood like a great sentinel against the northern sky, Thror King, under the mountain, felt the earth tremble beneath his feet. The ancient dragon that slept in the depths of the mountain stirred in his dreams, and his breath sent tremors through the deepest mines where the dwarves delved for mithril and gold. Yet it was not the dragon's awakening that troubled the king's sleep. It was a darker dream that came to him in the watches of the night. In his vision, he saw the fair realm of Nargothrond consumed by flame, its halls filled with the cries of the dying and the laughter of orcs. He saw the great bridge that spanned the Narog cast down into the rushing waters, and the hidden doors sealed forever by avalanche and ruin. Most terrible of all, he saw a figure in black standing amid the devastation, tall and proud, with eyes like stars gone cold, and a sword in his hand that seemed to drink the light from the air around it. The Dwarf King woke with a start, his beard damp with sweat, and his heart hammering like the great forges of his people. Around him, the walls of his chamber seemed to press close, as though the mountain itself had grown restless in the night. He rose and walked to the great window that looked out over the valley of Dale, where the lights of men twinkled like earth-bound stars in the darkness. From the south came riders, their horses lathered with foam, and their faces grim with the weight of evil tidings. These were the messengers of Gil-galad, the High King, who ruled in Linden beside the Western Sea, and their errand was urgent and dark. war was coming to Middle-earth. Not the petty conflicts of orcs and wolves that had troubled the borders for so long, but a great war that would decide the fate of all the free peoples. Thror received the messengers in his great hall, where the Arkenstone blazed like a captive star upon his throne. The light of that jewel had shone in the darkness for 3,000 years, a symbol of the endurance of the dwarves and their defiance of all who would make them bow. Yet even its radiance seemed dimmed by the shadow of the news the riders brought. Sauron the Deceiver has left his fortress in Mordor, spoke the chief of the messengers, a tall elf whose armor bore the device of Gil-galad. His armies march forth from the Black Gate, and before them goes a darkness that devours all light. The realms of men falter, and even the havens of the Eldar are not safe from his malice. The High King calls upon all who love freedom to stand with him in this dark hour. The Dwarf King stroked his long beard and pondered these tidings, for the affairs of elves and men had long seemed distant from the concerns of his people. Yet he remembered the ancient alliance that had bound the dwarves to the throne of Gil-galad, and the oaths sworn in the days when the kingdom under the mountain was young. Long have the dwarves stood apart from the wars of the tall folk, Thror said at last. Our halls are deep, our gates are strong, and our axes are sharp. Why should we abandon the safety of stone to die beneath foreign stars? The elf messenger stepped forward, and his eyes held the light of one who had looked upon the uttermost west. Because, Lord of the Dwarves, there will be no safety anywhere if the darkness triumphs. Sauron seeks not merely conquest, but the corruption of all living things. His shadow will reach even into the deepest halls, and neither door nor wall will avail against the poison of despair. In the depths of the mountain, something stirred that had slept for long ages. Smaug the Golden, greatest of the fire drakes of the north, lifted one great eye and gazed into the darkness of his lair. The smell of war was in the air, and with it the scent of gold and blood that the dragon loved above all things. Soon, very soon, it would be time to wake. Far from the councils of kings and the marchings of armies, in a land where the grass grew green and the streams ran clear beneath willows old as time, there dwelt a people who knew little of the great affairs of the world. The Shire lay peaceful under the protection of the Rangers, and its folk went about their daily business of farming and trading, of pipe smoking and storytelling, with scarce a thought for the darkness that gathered in distant lands. In Bag End, the finest hobbit hole in all of Hobbiton, Bilbo Baggins sat in his study, surrounded by maps and books, and papers covered with the strange script of the elves. He was writing, as had become his custom in the long years since his return from the great adventure, setting down the tale of his journey to the lonely mountain, and the finding of the ring that now rested heavy upon his finger. The hobbit paused in his writing and gazed out through the round window at the party tree, where the young hobbits of the neighborhood played in the golden light of evening. Their laughter carried on the warm air, sweet and innocent as birdsong. Yet to Bilbo's ears, it seemed strangely distant, as though it came from another world entirely. The ring upon his finger grew cold, and for a moment, the peaceful scene before him wavered like a reflection in troubled water. In that moment of distortion, he saw other images, dark towers rising against a red sky, armies of orcs marching beneath banners of flame, and a great eye that searched the world with malice beyond measure. The vision lasted only an instant, But it left him shaken, for he knew that what he had seen was not merely imagination, but a glimpse of things that were, or would be, or might yet come to pass. The ring whispered to him in the silence of his study, its voice so soft that it might have been mistaken for the sound of his own breathing. It spoke of power and glory, of the great deeds he might accomplish if only he had the courage to claim his destiny. It reminded him of how the dwarves and men had looked upon him with awe when he stood invisible among them, and how even the great dragon Smaug had feared the unseen hand that stole his treasures. But Bilbo was wiser now than he had been in the days of his youth, and he recognized the ring's voice for what it was. Not his own thoughts, but the echo of another will, ancient and malevolent, that sought to bend all things to its purpose. He pulled his hand away from the golden band and forced himself to return to his writing, though the words seemed to blur upon the page. Outside his window, the light was fading, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Among them sailed the ship of Eärendil, bearing the Silmaril that had once shone in the crown of the Elven king, and its light was a comfort to all who loved freedom and beauty in the world. Yet even that blessed radiance seemed dimmer than it had in years past, as though some great shadow was rising to challenge the very stars. In the Shire that night, many hobbits felt a strange unease, though few could have said what troubled them. Dogs barked at empty air, and cats prowled restlessly through gardens where no mice stirred. The old folk spoke of ill dreams and portents, while the young made jest of their fears and sang louder to drown out the whispers of the wind. But in Bag End, Bilbo Baggins sat long into the night, writing by candlelight of dragons and treasures, of courage found in unlikely places and friendships forged in the fires of adversity. And though he knew it not, his words would one day kindle hope in hearts that had forgotten how to dream, and his story would become a beacon for those who walked in darkness, reminding them that even the smallest person could change the course of the future if they had the will to try. The ring lay quiet upon his finger, biding its time, waiting for the day when its true master would call it home. But that day was yet to come, and until then it would sleep, dreaming perhaps of the fires of Mount Doom and the hand that had first claimed it in the darkness beneath the world, in the white halls of Rivendell, where the waters of Bruinen sang their eternal song, and the light of Eärendil's star seemed always to rest upon the walls. Elrond, half elven, stood before a great map that showed all the lands of Middle-earth. Beside him stood the wizard Gandalf, though he bore then another name and wore robes of blue instead of grey, and their voices were low with the weight of counsel that would shape the fate of ages. "The time has come," said Elrond, his finger tracing the winding path that led from the grey havens to the lonely mountain. "The shadow grows strong in the east, and soon it will move openly against all the free peoples. We must act now, while yet we may, to kindle such lights as will shine in the darkness that is coming." Gandalf nodded, his keen eyes studying the ancient parchment where the roads of Middle-earth were marked in silver ink. The dwarves of Erebor stir in their halls, and their king looks with longing toward the mountain of his fathers. If we could but give them cause to march, to reclaim what was lost, then the north would not stand empty when the storm breaks. The wizard's staff gleamed softly in the lamplight, and upon its head the crystal caught and held the radiance like a captured star. In that light, the two lords of the wise could see many things. The paths of the future spreading out like branches of a great tree, each choice leading to different endings, all fraught with peril and hope in equal measure. There is one among the Shire folk who has already played his part in the great tale, Elrond said thoughtfully. The ring-bearer walks in innocence still, but the gold he carries grows heavy with the weight of destiny. Through him, perhaps, the dwarves might be moved to action. In the depths of Rivendell's archives, where the records of 3 ages lay stored in cases of mithril and gold, ancient prophecies spoke of a time when the heirs of Durin would return to their ancestral home, and when they did, the fire of the mountain would wake to consume both friend and foe. The dragon Smaug had guarded the treasure hoard for 60 years, but dragons were proud creatures, and pride could be turned to both advantage and ruin by those who knew its ways. Gandalf stroked his long beard, and in his eyes was the gleam of one who has seen a plan take shape in the mists of possibility. A burglar, he mused. What the dwarves need is a burglar, one small and quiet, who could slip past the dragon's guard and find the weakness in his armor of scales. And I know just the hobbit for such a task. The wizard's laughter rang through the halls of Rivendell like the sound of silver bells. Yet beneath its mirth was a note of sadness, for he knew that the path he contemplated would bring both glory and sorrow to those who walked it. The hobbit would play his part, and the dwarves theirs, and in the end, the dragon would fall and the mountain be reclaimed. But the cost would be high, and not all who set out on the quest would live to see its ending. Time runs short, Elrond said, rolling up the great map with careful hands. Already the servants of darkness gather their strength, and the shadow of Dol Guldur spreads across the lands like a plague. If Smaug is to be dealt with, it must be soon, before greater evils wake and walk abroad. As if summoned by their words, a cold wind stirred through the halls of Rivendell, carrying with it the scent of distant fires and the echo of drums beaten in the deep places of the earth. The time of hidden council was ending, and the hour of open war drew near. Soon the wise would put aside their books and take up their swords, and the final battle between light and darkness would begin in earnest. But first, there would be smaller battles, quieter victories, and the courage of unlikely heroes who would kindle hope in the darkest hour. A burglar's work, perhaps, but upon such small deeds, the fate of the world often turned. Deep beneath the lonely mountain, in chambers carved from the living rock by the hands of Durin's folk in ages past, the great dragon stirred at last from his long slumber. Smaug the mighty, Smaug the impenetrable, Smaug the unassailable, felt the tremors that ran through the earth like the heartbeat of the world itself, and his golden eyes opened to pierce the darkness of his lair. For 60 years he had lain coiled upon the vast hoard of the dwarf kings, his scales drinking in the light of countless gems and goblets, his dreams filled with the memory of fire and conquest. But now something had changed in the world above. A stirring of old powers, a quickening of the blood in mortal veins, and the scent of fear that rose like smoke from the cities of men. The dragon's great head lifted from its bed of gold, and his breath sent ripples through the piles of treasure that surrounded him like a glittering sea. Coins cascaded from his flanks in golden waterfalls, and the sound of their falling was like the music of greed made manifest. In the red glow of his eyes, the carved faces of ancient kings seem to move and whisper, telling tales of glory long faded and kingdoms turned to dust. "What wakes me from my rest?" rumbled Smaug, and his voice was like the sound of avalanches in the high places of the earth. "What dares disturb the sleep of Smaug the Terrible? I smell dwarf stench in the wind, and the fierce sweat of men who whisper my name in their hovels of wood and stone." Far above, in the ruins of Dale, the few men who still dwelt in the shadow of the mountain felt the ground shake beneath their feet. Children cried in their mothers' arms, and dogs howled at the empty sky, for even the beasts could sense that something vast and terrible had awakened in the depths below. The master of Lake Town, sitting in his great hall beside the long lake, felt his wine cup tremble in his hand and wondered what evil omen this might portend. But it was not only the shaking of the earth that marked the dragon's waking. A red light began to glow in the depths of the mountain, seeping through cracks in the stone like blood from a wound. The ancient forges of the dwarves, cold for 6 decades, began to smoke and steam as the dragon's fire heated the metal that lay within them. And in that hellish glow, shapes moved that had not been seen since the day of Smaug's coming. The ghosts of the slain, perhaps, or merely shadows cast by the dragon's wings. Smaug uncoiled his great length and began to move through the halls that had once rung with the songs of the dwarf lords. His claws struck sparks from the stone floors, and where he passed, the very air grew thick with the heat of his wrath. He remembered the taste of dwarf flesh and the screams of the dying, and his heart quickened with the anticipation of slaughter to come. At the great gate of Erebor, where the river flowed out from the heart of the mountain, the dragon paused and lifted his head to taste the wind. It carried many scents: the green smell of growing things, the salt tang of distant seas, and beneath it all, the subtle trace of magic that spoke of wizards abroad in the world. This last scent stirred something deep in the dragon's memory, a half-forgotten fear from the days when he was young and the world was wider. "Wizards," he hissed, and flame flickered between his fangs, always meddling, always scheming, always seeking to thwart the will of their betters. "But I am Smaug the Mighty, last of the great fire drakes, and no wizard spell can turn aside my wrath." Yet even as he spoke these words, a shadow of doubt crept into the dragon's heart, for in his dreams he had seen a vision of his own ending, a black arrow flying true, and darkness closing over his golden eyes. He shook his great head to dispel such thoughts, for what power in Middle-earth could stand against the fury of Smaug the Terrible? The dragon's roar echoed through the halls of Erebor and out into the world beyond, a sound like thunder mixed with the screams of the damned. It rolled across the waters of the long lake and into the ears of men who had never heard its like, and they knew that their time of peace was ending. The fire had awakened, and with it, the first act of the great war that would decide the fate of all the free peoples of the world. In the fortress of Barad-dûr, where the dark tower rose like a spike of black iron against the crimson sky of Mordor, Sauron, the necromancer, felt the tremor that ran through the earth at the dragon's waking. His lidless eye turned toward the north, where the lonely mountain stood like a beacon of fire in the gathering darkness, and his lipless mouth curved in what might have been called a smile. The Maya, who had once served Aule the smith in the halls of the Valar, now sat upon a throne of obsidian and steel, his form terrible to behold, yet beautiful still, with the fallen beauty of the Ainur. About him the air shimmered with heat and malice, and the very stones of his fortress wept tears of molten metal. In his right hand he bore a mace of black iron, and upon his brow sat a crown of fire that burned but was not consumed. "The fire drake wakes," he said to the shadows that served him, and his voice was like the sound of forge hammers in the deep places of the earth. Long has he slept upon his hoard, dreaming of gold and glory, but now the old hungers stir in his heart. Soon he will move, and with his moving the north will burn. Around the Dark Lord's throne stood the Nine, who had once been kings of men, but were now wraiths bound to his will by rings of power. Their faces were hidden behind masks of steel, and their breath was the cold wind of the grave. They spoke not, for they had no need of words to communicate with their master, but their presence was like a weight upon the world, a shadow that fell across the hearts of all who loved the light. From the depths of Mordor came the sound of marching feet, as endless columns of orcs and wolves poured forth from the breeding pits where they had been forged in mockery of the children of Ilúvatar. Their banners bore the lidless eye of their master, and their weapons gleamed with the cold light of steel quenched in the blood of innocence. They marched not toward the borders of Gondor or Rohan, as might have been expected, but northward, toward the passes that led to Rhovanion and the lands beyond. "Let the dragon burn," Sauron commanded, and his words carried the weight of absolute authority. "Let him destroy what he will, and gather what enemies he may. For in the end, all shall serve my purpose, and the fire that he kindles will light the way for my own return." In the armories of Barad-dûr, weapons were being forged that had not been seen since the days of the War of Wrath, when the hosts of Valinor had come at last to Middle-earth to cast down Morgoth, the black foe. Swords of black steel that could cleave both flesh and spirit, spears that never missed their mark, and armor that turned aside even the arrows of the Eldar. These were not made for the crude orcs who served as the Dark Lord's foot soldiers, but for captains and champions who would lead the final assault against the strongholds of the free peoples. Yet greatest of all the weapons in that fell armory was one that remained unfinished, a blade of such power and malice that its very forging would require the One Ring itself. This was Gurthang reborn, the Iron of Death made new, and when it was complete, no armor in Middle-earth would avail against its edge. But that work must wait, for the ring lay still upon the finger of a halfling in the Shire, and its location remained hidden from the Dark Lord's sight. The Nazgûl stirred at their master's feet, sensing his thoughts as they turned toward the ring of power that had been lost so long ago. Soon, very soon, they would ride forth from Mordor to search for it, following paths of shadow and rumor, leaving death and terror in their wake. But not yet. First, the dragon must play his part, and the north must burn, and the free peoples must be driven to desperation before the final trap was sprung. Sauron's laughter echoed through the halls of Barad-dûr, a sound like breaking glass and falling stones. The game was afoot at last, and all the pieces were moving toward their appointed places. Victory was not certain. It never was when the children of Ilúvatar were involved, but the odds were better now than they had been for many long years. The shadow was rising, and this time it would not be turned back by the light of the Silmarils. or the swords of the Númenóreans. This time, darkness would cover all the world, and only Sauron's will would remain to give it shape and purpose. In the days that followed the dragon's waking, when the smoke of Smaug's fury darkened the northern sky, and the men of Lake Town barred their doors against the terror that stalked the land, 13 dwarves and a hobbit came at last to the secret door in the side of the lonely mountain. They had travelled far from the halls of Bag End, through perils beyond counting, and their number had been tested by goblin blades and spider webs, by the madness of the woodland realm and the greed of men. Thorin Oakenshield, heir of Durin and rightful king under the mountain, stood before the entrance that had been hidden for 60 years, his hand upon the key that his grandfather had carried into exile. Behind him, his companions waited in the gathering dusk, their faces grim with the knowledge that this might be their last hour upon Middle-earth. The dragon's roar still echoed in their ears, and the mountain trembled with his wrath. "Baruch Khazad," cried Thorin, speaking the ancient war cry of his people as he turned the key in the lock. "The dwarves are upon you." The door swung open with a sound like sighing wind, revealing a passage that led into the heart of the mountain, where gold and dragon fire waited in equal measure. But it was not the Dwarf King who first entered the ancestral halls. It was Bilbo Baggins, burglar by appointment and hobbit by nature, who crept forward into the darkness with the ring of power upon his finger and courage in his heart that even he did not know he possessed. The dragon lay sleeping upon his hoard, his great bulk coiled like a golden serpent amid the treasures of ages, and his breathing shook the very foundations of the mountain. In that moment, as the hobbit gazed upon the vastness of Smaug's wealth and the terrible beauty of the sleeping worm, the fate of the north hung balanced upon the edge of a knife. One careless step, one moment's greed, and all would be lost in fire and ruin. But Bilbo had learned wisdom in his travels, and he took only what was needed: the Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain, which blazed with inner light like a star caught in crystal. The taking of that jewel was like a bell tolling in the deep places of the earth, and Smaug's eyes opened to behold the thief who dared disturb his rest. The dragon's roar shook dust from the ancient rafters, and his breath turned stone to slag and gold to molten streams. But the hobbit was gone, vanished like smoke, protected by the ring that made him invisible to even the keenest sight. What followed was fire and fury, such as had not been seen since the elder days, when dragons were many and their wings darkened the sky from sea to sea. Smaug burst forth from the mountain like a comet of destruction, his rage terrible to behold, and the men of Esgaroth cowered behind their wooden walls as death descended from the sky on wings of flame. Yet in that hour of terror, when all seemed lost and the dragon's victory assured, an arrow flew true from the bow of Bard the bowman, heir of Girion, who had ruled in Dale before its fall. The black arrow found the gap in Smaug's armor that Bilbo had discovered, and the great worm fell like a burning star into the waters of the long lake, his death cry echoing across the world like the last note of a broken song. The lonely mountain stood empty then, its halls echoing with silence after so many years of the dragon's breathing. Thorin and his companions entered their ancestral home and beheld the treasures that had been gathered by 7 generations of dwarf kings: gold and silver, gems and weapons, artifacts of power and beauty beyond measure. But with the treasure came a curse, the dragon sickness that turned hearts to stone and made misers of kings. In the end, it was war that cleansed the mountain, the battle of 5 armies, where dwarves and men and elves stood together against the hosts of goblins and wolves that came down from the misty mountains like a plague of darkness. Thorin fell in that battle, struck down at the moment of victory, and with his death, the curse was broken and the kingdom made clean. But the victory came at a price that would echo through the ages. For in the fighting, other powers stirred, and the eye of Sauron turned its attention toward the north, where a ring of power had been found and lost and found again. The game was changing, and darker moves were yet to come. In the quiet days that followed the Battle of 5 Armies, when the dead had been buried with honor and the wounded had begun to heal, Bilbo Baggins walked the long road home to the Shire with a treasure upon his finger that none suspected. The ring of power lay hidden beneath his glove, its golden surface unmarked by dragon fire or goblin blade, and its voice was silent in his mind. For now, the hobbit thought himself fortunate to have escaped the madness that had taken hold of the Dwarf King in his final days. The dragon sickness that turned gold to poison and friends to enemies. He had seen enough of treasure and glory to last him many lifetimes, and his heart yearned for nothing more than his own armchair and the sound of kettles singing in his kitchen. Yet the ring went with him, heavy with the weight of destinies unguessed. Behind him, in the halls of Erebor, Dain Ironfoot ruled as king under the mountain, and the forges burned bright once more as the dwarves rebuilt what the dragon had destroyed. But in the deepest vaults, where the greatest treasures lay, strange dreams troubled those who kept the night watch. They spoke of a great eye that searched the darkness, and of a voice that called to something hidden in the mountain's depths. In Dol Guldur, the necromancer felt the ripples of power that spread out from the north like rings upon a still pond. Something had been awakened by the dragon's death, some ancient working that had slept in the shadow of Smaug's presence. The Dark Lord's attention, which had been focused on the movements of armies and the forging of weapons, now turned towards smaller things, hobbits and rings, and the curious power that bound them together. Yet still, the true nature of Bilbo's treasure remained hidden, even from the keenest sight. The ring had learned cunning in its long years of hiding, and it wore the guise of a simple magic trinket, useful for burglary, but hardly the stuff of legend. It whispered no secrets to its bearer, revealed no visions of power, and seemed content to rest upon the hobbit's finger like any common piece of jewelry. In Rivendell, Elrond felt the change that had come over the world with the dragon's passing, but even his wisdom could not pierce the veil that shrouded the ring's true nature. He knew that Bilbo had found something in the goblin tunnels, some token of power that had aided him in his adventures. But the hobbit spoke little of such things, and the elf lord did not press him for details. Gandalf the Grey, who walked again the paths of Middle-earth after long absence, paused often in his journeys to consider the signs and portents that multiplied with each passing day. The dragon was dead, the mountain reclaimed, and yet the shadow in the east seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker. It was as though Smaug's defeat had been not an ending, but a beginning, the first move in a game whose rules were known only to the enemy. The wizard's thoughts turned often to the Shire and the hobbit who had surprised the world with his courage. There was something about Bilbo's tale that nagged at him, some detail that seemed to shift and change each time it was examined. The story of the riddle game in the dark, of the creature called Gollum, and the ring that was found. It had the flavor of truth, yet also of concealment, as though important parts had been left unsaid. But these were subtle matters, and the world had more pressing concerns. War clouds gathered in the east, and the free peoples looked to their defenses and sharpened their swords. The time of hidden things was passing, and soon all secrets would be dragged into the light, the ring among them. In Bag End, Bilbo Baggins settled back into the comfortable routines of hobbit life, tending his garden and writing his memoirs, and entertaining the occasional visitor with tales of his adventures. The ring upon his finger grew slowly heavier as the years passed, though he told himself it was only his imagination. Sometimes, in the depths of night, he thought he heard it whispering, not words, but something deeper and more primal, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The time of testing was yet to come, when the ring would wake fully and call to its master with a voice that could not be ignored. But for now, it slept, dreaming perhaps of fire and gold, of the halls where it was forged, and the hand that would claim it in the end. In the spring that followed the dragon's death, when the first green shoots pushed through the ash-covered earth around the lonely mountain, a great council was held in the halls of Rivendell. Lords of the Eldar came from Lindon and Lothlorien, and with them came Gandalf the Grey, whose staff bore new scars from battles fought in darkness. The matter they debated was one that had troubled the wise for many years: the growing shadow in Dol Guldur and the evil that made its dwelling there. Saruman the White, chief of the wizards and most learned in the lore of rings, spoke with the authority of one who had delved deep into the secrets of the enemy. His voice was smooth as silk, yet beneath its surface ran currents of pride and ambition that the keenest among the council marked but did not challenge, for his wisdom was great and his power undoubted. Too long have we suffered this shadow to grow in our very borders, he declared, his white robes gleaming in the lamplight like snow upon a mountaintop. The necromancer has made of Mirkwood a place of terror, and his creatures multiply like vermin in the darkness. The time has come to strike, to drive this evil from its fastness before it grows too strong to challenge. Elrond and Galadriel spoke in support of this council, though their words were measured and their faces grave. They had felt the shadow's touch upon their own realms, had seen the corruption spread like poison through wood and stream. Yet they knew also that the enemy was subtle beyond measure, and that what seemed like victory might prove to be defeat in disguise. The assault upon Dol Guldur came with the turning of the season, when the leaves of Mirkwood began to gold and red beneath the autumn sky. The White Council rode to war with banners flying and weapons gleaming, and the very air around them shimmered with the power of the Eldar. At their head rode Saruman, upon a horse white as foam, his staff blazing with light that drove back the shadows and made the creatures of darkness flee before him. The fortress of the necromancer stood upon a hill that had once been fair, in the days when it was called Amon Lunk and the wood elves danced beneath its trees. But now it was a place of terror, its towers black as midnight and its walls weeping tears of poisonous sap. From its depths came the sound of screams and the clash of weapons, and the very stones were hot to the touch with the heat of evil fires. The battle that followed was brief but fierce, for the necromancer did not stand to fight, but withdrew before the advancing host, like mist before the morning sun. His servants, orcs and wolves, spiders and wargs, fought with the fury of desperation, but they were no match for the combined might of the wise. The towers of Dol Guldur fell with a sound like thunder, and their stones were scattered to the four winds. Yet even as the council celebrated their victory, Gandalf felt a chill touch his heart. The enemy had yielded too easily, had abandoned his stronghold with barely a struggle. This was not the way of Sauron, who was proud beyond measure and slow to retreat from any position of strength. The wizard's grey eyes searched the ruins of the fortress, seeking some sign of the trap he knew must be there. In the deepest dungeons of Dol Guldur, where the necromancer had worked his foulest sorceries, Gandalf found what he was looking for: empty cells that had once held prisoners of great worth and altars stained with the blood of sacrifice. But the captives were gone, spirited away in the night, and with them had gone knowledge that might have proven invaluable in the wars to come. "He has withdrawn to Mordor," Saruman declared when the search was ended. "The shadow is broken, and it will be long years before it dares to show its face again in the open world." But Gandalf was not so sure. He had seen the signs and portents that multiplied with each passing day, had felt the growing strength of the enemy even as his visible presence diminished. The necromancer had not been defeated. He had simply changed his strategy, trading one stronghold for another, sacrificing the lesser for the greater. As the council prepared to depart from the ruins of Dol Guldur, a darkness fell over the forest that had nothing to do with the setting of the sun. The trees whispered of evil things that moved in the night, and the very air grew thick with the promise of storms to come. The shadow had withdrawn, but it had not departed, and its absence was more ominous than its presence had ever been. In Mordor, behind the black walls of Barad-dûr, Sauron the Deceiver smiled as reports reached him of the council's victory. They had driven him from his lesser fortress, thinking to deal him a mortal blow, but they had only freed him to focus his attention on greater prizes. The time of hiding was ending, and soon the world would feel the full weight of his wrath. In the years that followed the cleansing of Dol Guldur, when the wise thought themselves victorious and the shadows seemed to have withdrawn from the borders of the free lands, there came a time of peace, such as Middle-earth had not known for many ages. The sun shone bright upon field and forest, the rivers ran clear and sweet, and children played in gardens where their grandparents had feared to walk. Yet in this time of seeming tranquility, those with eyes to see marked signs and portents that spoke of storms yet to come. Eagles flew south from their nests in the misty mountains, carrying word of strange lights in the east and of a darkness that grew beyond the range of Ered Lithui. The Ents stirred in Fangorn, and their voices were troubled as they spoke of trees that withered without cause and streams that ran bitter in their beds. In the Shire, Bilbo Baggins grew old with unusual grace, his face barely lined despite the passing of decades, and his step still light upon the paths of Hobbiton. The ring upon his finger had preserved him from the ravages of time, though he knew it not, and he walked among his people like one blessed by the Valar themselves. Yet sometimes, in the deep watches of the night, He would wake with dreams of fire and darkness, and the ring would seem to burn upon his hand like a coal from some fell furnace. The Hobbit's book grew thick with tales of adventure and wonder, but the true heart of his story remained unwritten. How could he set down in words the weight of the ring, the way it whispered in the darkness of his study, the dreams that came to him of a great eye that searched the world with malice beyond measure? These things seemed too strange for the comfortable folk of the Shire, too terrible for the world of gardens and pipe smoke that he had returned to love. In Gondor, the stewards of the throne watched the borders with growing unease, for their scouts brought word of movements in Mordor, not the great armies that would herald open war, but smaller, more sinister things, creatures that walked on two legs but were not men, shapes that flew by night with wings like leather, and always the sense of eyes watching from the darkness beyond the borders of the free lands. King Thranduil of the Yidaka woodland realm felt the change most keenly, for his people dwelt closest to the cleansed fortress of Dol Guldur. The wood was healing, it was true. The giant spiders were fewer, and the paths that had been choked with thorns began to clear. Yet still, his warriors reported strange encounters in the deep places of the forest, glimpses of figures in black that vanished when challenged, and voices that spoke in tongues, not heard since the elder days. Gandalf the Grey walked the roads of Middle-earth with growing urgency, his staff worn smooth by many journeys, and his grey robes stained with the dust of far places. He had begun to piece together the fragments of a greater puzzle, to see the pattern that connected the dragon's death, the cleansing of Dol Guldur, and the Hobbit's strange tale of a ring found in darkness. The answer, when it came to him at last, was both terrible and wonderful. Terrible in its implications, wonderful in the courage it revealed in the most unlikely of hearts. In the libraries of Minas Tirith, ancient scrolls spoke of the rings of power and their making, of the one ring that was forged in secret to command all others. These texts had long been dismissed as legend, tales told to frighten children in the dark. But now, as Gandalf read them by candlelight in the deep hours before dawn, he saw the truth that had been hidden in plain sight for so many years. The ring was real, and it rested on the finger of a hobbit in the Shire, growing slowly stronger as its master's power waxed in the east. Soon, very soon, it would call out with a voice that could not be denied, and then the final game would begin, a game in which the fate of all the free peoples would hang upon the courage of the small and seemingly powerless. Yet even as this knowledge filled him with dread, Gandalf felt also a glimmer of hope, for he had seen the strength that lay hidden in gentle hearts, had witnessed the power of simple kindness to turn aside the greatest evil. If the ring must wake, if the darkness must rise, then let it face not armies of steel, but the quiet courage of those who fought not for glory, but for the simple right to tend their gardens and love their neighbors. The fire had been kindled long ago in the forges of Mount Doom and the hearts of those who would not bow to tyranny. Now it would burn bright one last time in the darkest hour, when all hope seemed lost and the shadow covered the world. And in that burning, perhaps, the light would find a way to endure, carried by small hands down long roads to places yet unknown. Thus ends this tale of the shadow of Dol Guldur, though the greater story of which it tells but a part was yet to unfold in the years that followed. For the ring would wake, and the darkness would rise, and in the end all would be decided by the choices made by those who loved the light more than they feared the dark.